Have you ever wondered what it takes to completely disappear from the world? Not for a day, not for a year, but for 6 decades? Before we dive into this story, I want to know something from you. Where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I love knowing where our listeners are tuning in from, whether you're in a quiet room or out in the wilderness yourself. This is the story of a person who made a choice that most of us couldn't even imagine. A choice to leave everything behind and vanish into the mountains. And what he found there, or what found him, well, that's what we're here to talk about. It was the spring of 1847 when Elias Boone walked away from civilization. He was 28 years old, a telegraph operator in the growing town of Asheville, North Carolina. Tall and lean, with hands that bore the calluses of both physical labor and the delicate work of Morse code, Elias had dark brown hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of weathered oak. People who knew him described him as quiet, but not unfriendly, the sort of person who could fix almost anything with wire and patience. He lived in a boarding house on Market Street, took his meals at the same tavern every evening, and walked the same route to work each morning at precisely 6 o'clock. By all accounts, he was unremarkable, dependable, forgettable even. Then one morning in April, he simply didn't show up for work. His room at the boarding house was empty. His few possessions, a spare shirt, a leather-bound journal, a tin cup, were gone. The only thing he left behind was 3 months' rent, paid in advance, and a single sentence written on the back of a telegraph form. "I have gone where the wires don't reach." Nobody saw him leave. Nobody knew where he went. And for the next 62 years, Elias Boone lived alone in the Appalachian wilderness, in a place so remote that maps didn't name it, and compasses seemed to lose their bearing. The mountains of western North Carolina in the mid-1800s were not like they are today. There were no hiking trails, no ranger stations, no marked paths for weekend adventurers. The wilderness was genuine and absolute. Dense forests of oak and hickory stretched for miles without interruption. Rhododendron thickets grew so thick that a person could stand 3 feet from another and never see them. The terrain rose and fell in steep ridges and hidden hollows where creeks ran cold and clear, and where the morning fog hung so heavy it felt like walking through clouds. This was the world Elias chose. What drove him there, we can only piece together from fragments, from interviews conducted decades later with the few people who encountered him, from the journal he kept, most of which was illegible by the time it was found, and from the strange artifacts discovered in the place he called home. The first documented sighting of Elias Boone after his disappearance came 3 years later, in the summer of 1850. A surveying crew working in the mountains west of Asheville reported seeing a figure watching them from a distant ridge. The man wore clothes made from animal hide and carried what looked like a walking staff. When they called out to him, he turned and disappeared into the forest with a speed that seemed impossible given the terrain. One of the surveyors, a fellow named Jasper Creel, wrote in his field notes, "We tried to follow, but the land itself seemed to close behind him. Within minutes, we had lost all sense of direction and had to backtrack to find our markers." Over the next 2 decades, similar sightings occurred, always brief, always from a distance. Hunters would spot him crossing a stream. A lone trapper would see smoke rising from a valley where no settlement existed. In 1863, during the height of the war between the states, a group of Confederate deserters fleeing into the mountains claimed they stumbled upon a cabin so well hidden that they nearly walked past it. They said a person emerged, bearded, silent, holding a rifle, and simply stared at them until they left. They never found the cabin again when they tried to return. Now, you might be thinking this is just another hermit story. The mountains were full of people who wanted to get away from society, especially during those turbulent years. And you would be right to think that. But Elias Boone's story has elements that set it apart. Elements that nobody has been able to explain even now, more than a century later. The first strange detail came from a traveling minister named Amos Pemberton, who kept detailed records of his journeys through the mountain communities. In 1872, Pemberton wrote about an encounter that troubled him for the rest of his life. He had been walking a rarely used trail when he heard someone speaking, not shouting, speaking in a normal conversational tone, as if addressing someone nearby. Pemberton approached quietly and saw a person sitting on a fallen log, talking. There was nobody else present. The person, whom Pemberton assumed was Elias, though he couldn't be certain, was having what appeared to be both sides of a conversation, changing his voice slightly for each response. Pemberton noted it was not the ranting of a madman, but rather the patient discussion of two reasonable individuals debating some point of philosophy. Except there was only one person present. I confess it unnerved me more than any sermon I have delivered on the nature of isolation. By the 1880s, the stories about the hermit in the mountains had taken on the quality of legend. People claimed he could predict weather changes days in advance, that animals followed him without fear, that he had found gold in the mountains but had no use for it. Most of these tales were surely exaggerations, the kind that grow when facts are scarce and imagination is abundant. But some details appeared too consistently to dismiss entirely. Multiple sources, hunters, loggers, people who had reason to be in those remote areas, reported the same peculiar observation. In certain valleys where Elias was known to frequent, sound behaved strangely. Voices would echo when they shouldn't. Footsteps would seem to come from multiple directions. One logger described it as the land talking back to itself. Another said, "You'd call out to your partner 50 feet away and hear your own voice return from 3 different ridges, all at slightly different times, like the mountain was learning how to speak." And speaking of that, have you ever been in a place where sound just felt wrong? Where the silence was too quiet or the echoes didn't make sense? Drop a comment if you've experienced anything like that. I'd love to hear about it. Let me tell you about Doc Harlan Vess because his account is one of the most detailed we have. Dr. Vess was a physician who served the scattered mountain communities in the 1890s, traveling by horse to reach patients in remote homesteads. He was a methodical person in his early 50s, with a reputation for skepticism when it came to superstition. In his medical bag, he carried not just instruments and medicines, but also a small notebook where he recorded unusual cases. In September of 1894, he wrote an entry that would later be published in a regional medical journal. Much to his embarrassment, he had been called to attend to a woman who had fallen ill at a settlement near the upper reaches of the Pigeon River. After treating her, he decided to take an unfamiliar route back, hoping to save time. The afternoon was clear, the autumn colors just beginning to show in the higher elevations. He had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when his horse became agitated, refusing to proceed down what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary trail. Doc Vess dismounted and tried to lead the animal, but it pulled back so forcefully that he feared it would injure itself. Being a practical person, he decided to investigate on foot before attempting to force the horse forward. He walked perhaps a quarter-mile down the trail and found nothing obviously wrong. The path was clear, the forest quiet. But as he stood there, he became aware of a peculiar sensation. He described it as a thickness to the air, as if the space itself had acquired density. The light seemed dimmer, though the sun was still visible through the canopy. And then he heard it, a sound like wind moving through trees, except there was no wind. The leaves hung perfectly still. Doc Vess was preparing to return to his horse when he saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing about 50 yards off the trail, so perfectly camouflaged by its surroundings that his eyes had passed over it several times before recognizing it as a structure. The logs were weathered to the exact gray of the surrounding stone outcroppings. Moss grew on the roof in patterns that made it blend with the forest floor. Even the smoke hole seemed designed to disperse smoke in a way that made it invisible against the sky. He called out a greeting. No response. He called again, identifying himself as a physician. Still nothing. Against his better judgment, he would later write, he approached the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, though that could have been a trick of the dim light. There was a stone fireplace, a sleeping platform made from pine boughs, a rough-hewn table. Tools hung on the walls, some he recognized, others whose purpose he couldn't determine. What struck him most was the order of it all. Every item had its place. Everything was clean, maintained, purposeful. This was not the dwelling of someone who had lost their mind to solitude. This was the home of someone who had found a different kind of order. On the table lay several objects that Doc Vess examined closely. A collection of stones, each one different. Quartz, mica, slate, granite, arranged in a pattern that seemed deliberate, but whose meaning he couldn't grasp. A series of carved wooden pieces, each one depicting the same symbol he didn't recognize. And a journal, open to a page covered in neat handwriting. Doc Vess later admitted he shouldn't have read it, but he did. The entry was dated September 11th, 1894, 3 days prior. It read, "The sounds are clearer now in this season. When the air cools and the leaves begin to fall, the boundary becomes thin. I can almost hear them on the other side, working at the same tasks I perform here, building fires, gathering water, living the same hours in a different fold of time. Sometimes I wonder if they can hear me too. If somewhere in the pattern there exists another version of this place where I never left, where I continued my ordinary life, and that version of me occasionally senses something else, a presence just beyond perception, a life unlived but somehow still occurring." The doctor stood in that cabin reading those words, and he felt something he had never experienced before, a sensation that the walls were thinner than they appeared, that if he reached out in just the right way, his hand might pass through into somewhere else entirely. He backed out of the cabin quickly, returned to his horse, and took a different route home, one that added 3 hours to his journey. He never tried to find that cabin again, but he wrote about it, and his account raises questions that nobody has answered. Was Elias Boone losing his grip on reality in his isolation, or had he discovered something in those mountains that exists outside our normal understanding? Now, before we go further, I want to take a moment to mention something. This story is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to the channel. We put a lot of work into researching and narrating these stories. And if you're hearing this on another channel, know that they've stolen our content without permission. Help us out and report it. We appreciate you being here with us. So where were we? Right, the mystery of what Elias Boone was experiencing in his solitude. Because the strange accounts don't stop with Doc Vess. In 1902, a young woman named Mabel Sutton was collecting ginseng in the mountains, a common practice for those who knew where to look. She was 26 years old, strong and capable, the daughter of a farming family who had lived in those hills for 3 generations. She knew the mountains as well as anyone could. That afternoon in late October, she was working a ridge she had harvested before, following a creek upstream to a place where ginseng grew thick in the shade of old hemlocks. She heard the humming first, a low, steady sound that seemed to come from the ground itself. She stopped, trying to locate the source, and realized it was coming from further up the creek, from a place where the water disappeared into a narrow gorge. She climbed toward it, curious, and found herself in a small box canyon she had never seen before, despite having passed this area many times. The walls of the canyon rose about 40 feet on 3 sides, covered in that deep green moss that grows only where water constantly seeps. The creek formed a small pool before flowing out through the gap she had entered, and sitting beside that pool, on a flat stone, worn smooth by centuries of water, was Elias Boone. She knew it was him immediately, though she had never seen him before. Who else would it be, this far from any settlement? He was in his 80s by then, his hair and beard completely white, his skin weathered dark by decades of sun and wind. He wore clothes that appeared to be made from deer hide, stitched with plant fibers. His hands rested on his knees, and he was humming that same low, steady sound she had heard. Mabel Sutton later said she should have been frightened. A young woman alone, encountering a strange individual in a place with no escape route. But she wasn't afraid. She felt something else, a deep calm, a sense that she had stumbled into a space that existed slightly outside the normal flow of time. She stood there, unsure whether to speak or leave quietly, when he opened his eyes and looked directly at her. His eyes, she said, were the most unsettling thing about him, not because they were wild or crazed, but because they were so utterly clear, so completely present, as if he was seeing not just her physical form, but something deeper. He spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, but perfectly articulate. "You're gathering plants," he said. Not a question, a statement. She nodded. "The roots go deeper here," he continued. "This place, the water carries something different. Minerals from stone that exist nowhere else in these mountains. The plants know it. That's why they grow stronger here." She found her voice. "How long have you been here?" she asked. He smiled slightly. In this canyon or in these mountains? She wasn't sure how to answer that, so she said, both. I came to the mountains in the spring of 1847, he said. 62 years next April. I found this canyon 7 years after that. I return here when the seasons change, to listen. Listen to what? She asked. He stood then, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for his age. He walked to the pool and knelt beside it. Come here, he said. She hesitated, then joined him at the water's edge. Look at the surface, he said. What do you see? She looked. The pool was perfectly still, reflecting the sky above, the stone walls around them. I see the reflection, she said. Now look below the surface. What do you see? She peered deeper into the water. She could see the bottom, smooth stones, a few fallen leaves, small fish darting in the shadows. I see what's beneath, she said. Exactly, he replied. Two things occupying the same space, the reflection and the reality. Both are there, both are real. But which one is true? She didn't know how to answer. He continued, I left civilization because I could hear both, the surface and the depths, the life I was living and the life I could have lived, all the versions of existence happening at once, and the sound of it was driving me toward madness. In the city, surrounded by people and noise, I couldn't separate them. But here, in the silence, I learned to listen to one at a time, to choose which reality to inhabit moment by moment. Mabel Sutton asked him the question that had been forming in her mind. Are you lonely? He was quiet for a long moment, still looking at the water. Finally, he said, I have more company here than I ever had among people. You asked what I listened to. I listened to all the other versions of myself who made different choices. The one who stayed in Asheville and married and had a family. The one who moved west and worked the railroads. The one who died young of fever. They're all here, living in the spaces between moments. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when the air is the right temperature and the water flows at the right speed, and the light hits the canyon at the right angle, I can almost see them, almost touch them, almost step through into their lives and let them step into mine. She wanted to ask more, but something in his expression stopped her. He stood and turned to leave, walking toward a gap in the canyon wall she hadn't noticed before, a narrow passage between the rocks. Before he disappeared, he looked back at her and said, The ginseng roots do go deeper here, but be careful how much you take. Some plants are anchors. Remove them, and other things might shift. Then he was gone. She waited a moment, then followed to the passage he had used. It led to another small canyon, and from there to a series of connected spaces like rooms in a stone house. But she never found him. And when she tried to return to that place a week later, she couldn't find it. The landscape seemed to have rearranged itself. The creek still flowed, the ridge still rose, but the canyon, with its pool and moss-covered walls, had simply ceased to exist in any location she could reach. Have you ever lost a place like that? Somewhere you've been that you can never find again? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. These stories of spaces that seem to shift, they appear more often than you might think. The final documented encounter with Elias Boone came in the winter of 1909. A trapper named Virgil Moss was checking his lines in the high country when a sudden storm moved in. These winter storms in the mountains were nothing to take lightly. They could bury a person in snow within hours, turn familiar trails into deadly mazes. Virgil was 43 years old, experienced in wilderness survival, but this storm caught him badly positioned, too far from his cabin to make it back before dark. He found shelter in the lee of a large boulder and was preparing to wait out the night when he saw a light through the falling snow. A steady glow, warm and yellow, impossibly bright for that kind of weather. Against all logic, he left his shelter and moved toward it. He said later that he felt pulled toward it, as if the light itself was calling him. He emerged into a clearing he had never seen before, and there stood a cabin. Not the cabin Doc Vess had described, or at least not in the same configuration. This one was different, larger, more elaborate. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through a window he could see firelight dancing on interior walls. The door opened before he could knock. Elias Boone stood there, impossibly old now, 90 years if he was the age Virgil later calculated, but still standing straight, still moving with purpose. "Come in," he said, as if he had been expecting him. "The storm will last until morning." Inside, Virgil found warmth and shelter beyond what should have been possible. The fire burned without seeming to consume wood. The interior was larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. On the walls hung items that made no sense. Photographs, though photography was still relatively rare in those mountains, showing places Virgil didn't recognize. A map of constellations with notations in a language he couldn't read. A collection of what appeared to be the same object, duplicated many times. A small, carved bird, each one identical to the others, arranged in a spiral pattern on a shelf. They sat by the fire. Elias offered him food, simple fare, cornbread and dried meat, but somehow the best Virgil had ever tasted. They didn't speak for a long time. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the cabin, the sound was muffled, distant, as if coming from very far away. Finally, Virgil asked the question that anyone would ask, "Why did you come here? Why did you stay?" Elias was quiet for so long that Virgil thought he might not answer. Then, "I found a door," he said. "Not a physical door, though there are those too if you know where to look. A door in understanding. In the telegraph office, I would send messages across wires, and I began to wonder, if words could travel that way, what else could? Thoughts, memories, entire lives. I started listening differently to the clicks and pauses of the telegraph, and I began to hear other messages. Messages that weren't being sent by anyone I knew, messages from places that didn't exist on any map." He poked at the fire, sending sparks upward. One message came through again and again, just 2 words, "Come home." I didn't know what it meant. Home was wherever I was born, wherever I was living. But the message persisted, and one day I realized it wasn't coming from a place. It was coming from a version of myself that had made different choices, a version that had found what I was looking for and was trying to guide me there. Virgil asked him, "And did you find it, this home?" Elias smiled, and in his smile was something both sad and content. "I've found many homes," he said. "Every choice we don't make, every path we don't take, it still exists somewhere, and if you know how to listen, you can find your way to those other lives. I've lived 100 different versions of my years in these mountains. In some of them, I built this cabin. In others, I never built anything at all. In some, I met people like you and shared stories. In others, I remained completely alone. They're all real. They're all happening. The storm continued through the night. Virgil slept on a pallet by the fire, and when he woke, the cabin was empty. Not abandoned, empty, as if it had never been furnished at all. The walls were bare, the fireplace was cold and contained no ash. The door stood open, and outside, the snow had stopped falling. Fresh powder covered the ground in an unbroken blanket, and there were no footprints anywhere, not his, not anyone's. He walked out into the winter morning, and when he looked back, there was no cabin. Just a clearing in the woods, notable only for a ring of stones that might have once been a foundation, or might have just been stones. Virgil Moss told this story to a newspaper reporter in 1923, 14 years after that winter night. He was dying of consumption, and he said he wanted someone to know what he had experienced, even if they didn't believe it. The reporter asked him if he thought Elias Boone had been real, or if perhaps the storm and cold had caused him to hallucinate the entire encounter. Virgil reached under his shirt and pulled out a small carved wooden bird hanging on a leather cord around his neck. "He gave me this before I slept," Virgil said. "Told me it was from one of the other versions of his life, where he had become a craftsman instead of a hermit. Said I should keep it to remember that we're all living more lives than we know." The bird was examined later. The wood was from a species of tree that hadn't grown in those mountains for over 200 years. According to a botanist who saw it, the carving technique was unlike anything known to Appalachian craftsmen of that era. But it existed. It was real. Virgil Moss wore it until the day he died, and it was buried with him. So, what do we make of Elias Boone? Was he a person who simply wanted to be alone and whose isolation led to delusion? Was he someone who discovered something genuine in those mountains, some aspect of reality that we don't understand? Or was he, as some have suggested, not really there at all? A story that grew in the retelling, a legend born from glimpses of other hermits and loners who lived in those hills. The thing is, we have evidence that he existed. Records show a telegraph operator named Elias Boone worked in Asheville in 1846 and 47. Those records stop abruptly in April of 1847. His signature appears on documents. His name shows up in a boarding house registry. These are facts. What happened after he left? That's where fact and mystery blur together like morning fog in a mountain valley. In 1956, a team of forestry researchers conducting a survey in the remote sections of what is now the Pisgah National Forest found something unusual. In a box canyon, accessible only by a narrow gap between rock walls, they discovered the remains of a structure. Not much was left. A few logs, a stone hearth, some metal objects corroded beyond identification. But they also found something else. A collection of journals wrapped in oiled cloth and sealed in a metal box that had protected them from moisture. Most of the journals were illegible. Decades of dampness had turned the pages into pulp despite the protection. But one journal, the last one apparently, had survived well enough to be partially readable. The entries were sporadic, sometimes with months or years between them. The handwriting matched samples of Elias Boone's writing from his telegraph operator days. The last entry was dated March 1909, just months before Virgil Moss's encounter with the cabin in the snow. Parts of it are still debated by the few researchers who have studied it because the content is, well, it's strange. I'll read you some of it, the sections that were clear enough to transcribe. I have been here long enough now to understand the pattern. The mountains are not just stone and earth. They are layers, folds in something larger. When I first arrived, I could only perceive one layer, the physical world, the trees and streams and sky. But over years, as the silence deepened and my perception shifted, I began to sense the others, parallel versions of this same space, occupied by parallel versions of existence. I am not alone here, and yet I am completely alone. In one layer, I built a cabin and lived a simple life of hunting and gathering. In another, I became something else, a wanderer who never stayed in one place, who walked the ridges endlessly, searching for something I never named. In yet another, I returned to civilization after only a few years, unable to sustain the isolation. All of these versions exist simultaneously. I can feel them pressing against this version like pages in a book pressed together. The boundary between them is thinnest in certain places. The canyon with the pool, the ridge where three streams converge, the clearing where the stones form a circle without any human hand placing them. In these places, I can sometimes step through. I can visit my other selves. I can see the lives I didn't live, and they can see me. We are all Elias Boone. We are all here. We are all making different choices in different versions of the same moment. The entry continued, but the writing became increasingly difficult to read, the words running together or trailing off into illegible marks. The final legible sentence read, "When I die in one layer, I will continue in the others. Death is just another doorway, another choice, another fold in the pattern." The journal was donated to a historical society in Asheville, where it remains to this day in climate-controlled storage. Scholars have examined it. Some believe it's authentic. Others think it's a hoax, something created later to add mystery to the legend. DNA testing wasn't available to verify the age of the ink or paper when it was first discovered, and by the time such testing became possible, the Historical Society was reluctant to damage the document. But here's something that can't be explained away. In the same metal box with the journals, the researchers found a photograph, an actual photograph, printed on paper stock that was dated through chemical analysis to approximately 1900 to 1910. The photograph showed a person standing in front of a log cabin. The person was elderly with white hair and beard, wearing clothes made from animal hide. Behind the person, barely visible, was another figure, and behind that one, another. Like a hall of mirrors, except each reflection was slightly different. Different poses, different expressions, different versions of the same person receding into the background of the image until they faded into shadow. Photography experts have examined it extensively. It's not a double exposure. It's not a trick of light or a flaw in the development process. It's an impossible photograph that nevertheless exists in physical form in an archive in North Carolina. Now, you might be wondering about the cabin itself. Did anyone ever find the actual structure? Well, yes and no. Over the years, hikers and hunters have reported finding abandoned cabins in remote sections of the mountains. None of them match the exact description from the various accounts. Some are too large, some too small. Some are in locations that don't align with the geographical details provided by witnesses. It's as if the cabin exists in multiple places at once, or in no specific place at all. just another fold in the pattern. I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were living multiple versions of your life at the same time? Like the choices you didn't make were still somehow happening in some other version of reality? Leave a comment. These philosophical questions, they're at the heart of Elias Boone's story. There's one more account I need to tell you about. This one is recent. Well, recent relatively speaking. It occurred in 1978, nearly 70 years after Elias Boone's presumed death. A person named Marcus Webb was backpacking through the Pisgah National Forest. He was 29 years old, an experienced outdoorsman, carrying proper equipment and following established trails. On the third day of his hike, he decided to explore a side path that wasn't on his map. He later said he felt drawn to it, though he couldn't explain why. The path led him into terrain that became increasingly difficult. The trees grew so dense that little sunlight reached the ground. The air grew cooler, and he noticed that sound behaved strangely. His footsteps seemed muffled, as if the forest itself was absorbing them. He was about to turn back when he emerged into a clearing. In the center of that clearing stood a cabin, not ruins, not an abandoned structure, a cabin that looked lived in. Smoke rose from the chimney. Firewood was stacked neatly beside the door. Herbs hung drying from the eaves. Marcus approached carefully and called out a greeting. No answer. He knocked on the door. It swung open at his touch. The interior was simple but well maintained. A fire burned in the hearth. A pot of something, stew maybe, simmered on a hook above the flames. Personal items were scattered about in a way that suggested someone had just stepped out temporarily. A book lay open on the table. Reading glasses rested beside it. A pair of boots stood by the door, still damp, as if someone had recently walked through wet grass. Marcus waited, thinking the resident would return soon. He waited for 20 minutes, then an hour. Nobody came. The fire continued to burn. The stew continued to simmer. Finally, uncomfortable with staying in someone's home uninvited, he left. He marked the location carefully on his map, taking compass readings and noting landmarks. When he returned with a friend 3 days later, they couldn't find the clearing. They searched for hours, following his compass readings, his landmarks. Nothing. The forest in that area was undisturbed, as if no human had walked through it in decades. No cabin, no clearing, no path. Marcus Webb is still alive. He's in his 70s now, living in Boone, North Carolina. I know this because a researcher contacted him in 2015. He still has the map with his notations. He still maintains that what he saw was real. But he's never been able to find that place again. And here's the detail that ties it all together. On the book that lay open on the cabin's table, he glimpsed the name written on the inside cover before he left. It was Elias Boone. The date beneath it was 1883. So we return to our original question. What are we to make of Elias Boone? I'll tell you what the evidence suggests, even if it doesn't provide definitive answers. The evidence suggests that Elias Boone was a real person who really did disappear into the Appalachian Mountains in 1847. The evidence suggests that he survived there for many decades, becoming increasingly isolated from society. And the evidence suggests that during his isolation, he experienced something, whether psychological, spiritual, or genuinely paranormal, that changed his perception of reality itself. Did he discover some property of those mountains that allowed him to access parallel versions of existence Or did his isolation, his years of complete solitude, alter his consciousness in a way that created elaborate internal worlds that felt as real as the physical one? Both explanations have problems. The first requires us to accept phenomena that violate our understanding of physics and reality. The second fails to account for the physical evidence, the photograph, the journal, the artifacts that multiple witnesses observed. Maybe the answer is that both are true. Maybe Elias Boone's internal transformation was so profound that it altered the physical world around him, or maybe the physical world was always more fluid than we understand, and his isolation simply allowed him to perceive and navigate that fluidity. In quantum mechanics, there's a concept called the many worlds interpretation. It suggests that every quantum event spawns multiple universes, each one representing a different possible outcome. In one universe, you made one choice. In another, you made a different choice. Both universes are equally real. They just don't interact with each other under normal circumstances. Is it possible that in those isolated mountains, far from the noise and interference of civilization, Elias Boone found a way to perceive or even cross between these parallel realities? It sounds like science fiction, I know, but quantum mechanics itself sounds like science fiction until you study it deeply enough to realize it's our best description of how reality actually functions at the smallest scales. Or maybe Elias Boone was simply a person who carried within him a deep sensitivity to the mystery of existence. Someone who felt the weight of all the lives we don't live, all the choices we don't make, and who couldn't bear to be surrounded by constant reminders of those unmade choices. So he went to the one place where he could explore them in silence, where he could listen to the echoes of other possibilities without the interference of actual human society. The truth is, we don't know. We can't know. The only person who truly understood what happened in those mountains was Elias Boone himself. And if the accounts are to be believed, even he existed in multiple versions, each with its own understanding, its own truth. What we do know is this: the Appalachian Mountains remain. The remote valleys and hidden canyons still exist. The places where streams converge and stones form circles and fog moves in patterns that seem almost deliberate. Those places are still there, waiting for anyone patient enough to find them. And if you do venture into those deep woods, into those forgotten hollows where maps lose their accuracy and compasses spin without settling, maybe you'll encounter something that doesn't fit your understanding of reality. Maybe you'll hear humming from an empty canyon. Maybe you'll see smoke rising from a valley where no settlement should exist. Maybe you'll find a cabin that wasn't there yesterday and won't be there tomorrow. And if that happens, if you find yourself standing at the threshold of something impossible, remember Elias Boone. Remember that he spent 62 years exploring the boundaries of what we think we know. Remember that he left behind evidence of something, whether madness or revelation or simply a different way of being, that we still can't fully explain more than a century later. The mountains keep their secrets well. They always have. And perhaps that's how it should be. Perhaps some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced. Perhaps some doors aren't meant to be opened, only acknowledged. Perhaps some lives aren't meant to be lived in the way we understand living, but rather sensed, felt, perceived in the spaces between moments. Elias Boone walked away from the world in 1847. He walked into the mountains, and in some version of reality, he's still there, still building fires and stone hearths that may or may not exist in this particular fold of time, still carving wooden birds in a workshop that appears only when the conditions are right, still humming that low, steady sound that some people hear in certain canyons on certain days when the air is cool and the fog is thick and the boundary between what is and what might have been grows thin enough to perceive. Some say he died in that final winter of 1909, alone in his cabin, his body never found, absorbed back into the mountains that had sheltered him. Others say he simply stepped through to one of those other layers he wrote about, choosing a different version of his life to inhabit. And still others say he never really left at all, that he's still there, living all those lives simultaneously, present in all the possible versions of that mountain wilderness at once. Which version is true? Oh, maybe all of them. Maybe none. Maybe truth itself is more fluid than we like to admit. And stories like Elias Boone's exist to remind us of that fluidity, to remind us that the world contains more possibilities than we can see from any single vantage point. So, what do you think? Do you believe there are layers to reality that we can't normally perceive? Do you think isolation and silence can open doors in consciousness that remain closed in the noise of civilization? Have you ever felt the presence of a life you didn't live hovering just at the edge of your awareness? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think about this. These are the kinds of stories that make us question everything we think we know about reality, time, and consciousness. And if you found yourself captivated by this story, if you stayed with it all the way to the end, do me a favor, share it with someone who would appreciate it. These deep dives into historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena, they take time to research and craft. Your support means everything. As for Elias Boone himself, wherever he is, whichever layer of reality he's currently inhabiting, I like to think he found what he was looking for. Peace, maybe, understanding, or perhaps just the freedom to exist outside the narrow constraints of a single linear life. 62 years alone in the wilderness. Most of us couldn't last 62 hours. But he did it. He lived it. And he left behind just enough evidence to make us wonder what we might discover if we had the courage to step off the path and into the unknown. Until next time, stay curious, question everything, and remember, the wilderness is still there, waiting for those brave enough or desperate enough to seek its secrets. We'll see you in the next one.